What happens when the most powerful families in the world are faced with death? While we often think of US presidents as figures of strength and authority, behind the polished facade are family tragedies that are as shocking as they are devastating. Today, we are going to explore the 15 most embarrassing deaths in US. First, families that were never fully acknowledged or have faded into obscurity. From scandals and unexpected accidents to personal struggles and public spectacles, these deaths will reveal a side of history you've never seen before. Prepare yourself for jaw-dropping, heartbreaking, and sometimes downright bizarre stories that have been buried under the weight of presidential legacies. Stick with us, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about the nation's most influential families. Let's dive into the first, and perhaps most overlooked, family tragedy in American presidential history. 1. George Washington Parke Custis, George Washington's step-grandson. Imagine being the step-grandson of George Washington, one of the most iconic figures in American history. You'd think that would be a life of grandeur, wealth, and power, right? Well, for George Washington Parke Custis, this couldn't have been further from the truth. His death, while not as notorious as his grandfather's achievements, had a strange embarrassment surrounding it that few people ever talk about. George Washington Parke Custis was adopted by George Washington when his own father died, and Washington became his father figure. But even with this strong connection to the first president, Custis never quite lived up to his famous grandfather's legacy. Instead, he became known for his personal failures, especially his inability to maintain the grandeur expected of someone with the Washington name. He inherited much of Washington's estate, but his life was filled with personal and professional missteps. These failures culminated in a death that was, to put it mildly, somewhat embarrassing. In 1857, Custis passed away at the age of 70, but his death wasn't marked by public mourning or even widespread recognition. Instead, it was largely overshadowed by the Civil War and the political struggles of the time. Custis's lack of a solid legacy was evident even in his passing. He had spent most of his life struggling to live up to the immense shadow of his grandfather, and his death was no exception. The embarrassment wasn't just in his inability to match Washington's legacy, it was in the quiet, almost ignored nature of his passing. It seemed to some that the Washington name had become a weight too heavy for him to carry. The idea of a man, connected to such a powerful legacy, fading into obscurity is, in itself, a tragic reminder of how history can sometimes forget those who don't live up to the hype. And Custis's death is just one of many moments in American history where great expectations meet the crushing reality of personal failure. While we all know about Washington's fame and achievements, the story of Custis, his failure to make something of the name, reminds us that not all descendants are destined for greatness. 2. Lucy Jefferson Lewis, Thomas Jefferson's daughter. Thomas Jefferson, one of the most prominent and complex figures in American history, had a personal life that was as tangled as his public life was impactful. His daughter, Lucy Jefferson Lewis, is not a name many people remember when they think of Jefferson's family. But her death at a young age is a heartbreaking chapter in Jefferson's personal life, one that, despite its profound emotional impact, has largely been overlooked. Lucy Jefferson Lewis, Jefferson's second daughter, lived a short and tragic life. Born in 1778, she passed away in 1781, just 25 years later. It was a time when the life expectancy for women was not much longer than Lucy's, but her death had a particular emotional toll on her father. Lucy was a bright and talented young woman who was deeply connected to her father, and Jefferson had high hopes for her future. She was seen as someone who could continue the Jefferson legacy of intellectual achievement and political involvement. But fate had different plans. The cause of Lucy's death has long been speculated. Some historians believe it was childbirth complications, as such tragic events were common in that era. Others suggest that her health had been poor for some time, but whatever the cause, her death left a deep emotional scar on Jefferson. The man who had so expertly navigated the American Revolution and had crafted the Declaration of Independence was left utterly devastated by the loss of his beloved daughter. What makes this death particularly poignant is how little we talk about it today. Jefferson, for all his political genius and influence on the nation, never truly recovered from the loss of Lucy. And it is this tragic chapter that highlights the vulnerability of even the most powerful men. For all of his achievements, Jefferson was not immune to the personal grief that comes with losing someone you love. His legacy has often been viewed through the lens of his political accomplishments, but his personal losses, like that of Lucy, are part of the much deeper, untold story of the man behind the legacy.
3. Benjamin Pierce, Franklin Pierce's son.
Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, is often remembered for his inability to effectively navigate the political landscape of his time, particularly as tensions surrounding slavery began to tear the nation apart. But beneath his political failures, there was a personal tragedy that profoundly affected his ability to lead: the death of his beloved son, Benjamin Pierce. In 1853, when Benjamin was just 11 years old, he died in a tragic train accident. The incident was sudden and horrific, and the grief it caused Franklin Pierce was immense. His son, whom he loved dearly, was killed when the train they were riding on derailed, leaving the entire family in shock. For a president whose administration was already crumbling under the weight of national crisis, this tragedy was almost too much to bear. The death of his son didn't just affect Pierce emotionally, it severely impacted his presidency. Many historians argue that Pierce's inability to recover from this loss contributed to his ineffective leadership during his time in office. Instead of confronting the issues of his presidency head-on, Pierce was left paralyzed by his grief. His public life was now marked by a man who had suffered an unbearable loss, and that loss seemed to bleed into every aspect of his administration. The death of Benjamin Pierce was not just a personal tragedy for Franklin Pierce. It was an embarrassment to a man whose leadership was already faltering. His inability to maintain the composure expected of a president, especially after such a tragic loss, only added to the perception of him as an ineffective leader. This death wasn't just a loss of a son, it marked the beginning of the end of Pierce's political career.
4. Willie Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son.
When we think of Abraham Lincoln, we often remember him as the great emancipator, the leader who guided the nation through the Civil War. But his presidency was also marked by immense personal tragedy, none more heart-wrenching than the death of his son, Willie Lincoln, in 1862. Willie was just 11 years old when he died from a fever, leaving both Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, devastated. At the time, Lincoln was already facing enormous pressure as the nation was embroiled in the Civil War, and the loss of his son only compounded his emotional and psychological burden. The death of a child is a pain that no parent can truly prepare for, but for Lincoln, it seemed as though the weight of the nation's struggles, combined with his personal sorrow, was more than he could bear. What makes Willie's death particularly tragic, and somewhat embarrassing for the first family, was how public it became. Lincoln, who had so carefully crafted an image of strength and resilience, was seen struggling with grief in front of the nation. The public mourning of Willie Lincoln was so intense that it became an event in itself, overshadowing the political events of the day. People across the country sympathized with Lincoln, but the emotional toll it took on him was evident, and the public spectacle of grief brought an uncomfortable visibility to the Lincoln family sorrow. Willie's death wasn't just a personal tragedy for the Lincolns, it was a public one as well. The family's grief was laid bare for all to see, and it was a reminder that even the greatest of men can be brought to their knees by the loss of a loved one.
5. Quentin Roosevelt. Theodore Rooseveltesson.
Theodore Roosevelt was a president known for his energy, his sense of adventure, and his larger-than-life persona. But even a man of his strength and vitality could not escape the devastating blow of losing a child. Theodore Roosevelt's younger son, Quentin, died in combat during World War I in 1918. Quentin Roosevelt, who was just 20 years old, was a fighter pilot in the war. His death was a crushing blow to Theodore Roosevelt, who had already endured personal tragedy throughout his life. The death of a son in such a violent and public way left Roosevelt devastated. While Roosevelt had always been a symbol of vigor and strength, the loss of Quentin shattered that image, revealing a man who was as vulnerable as anyone else when faced with the death of a loved one. What made Quentin's death particularly tragic was the sense of futility that often accompanies a loss in war. Here was a young man, filled with promise and potential, whose life was cut short by the horrors of battle. Roosevelt's grief was compounded by the fact that his son had been serving in a war that he, as a former president, had once supported with great enthusiasm. The fact that Quentin was killed in action made his death all the more poignant, and it became one of the defining moments in Roosevelt's life. Quentin's death was not just a private sorrow for Theodore Roosevelt, it was a national tragedy. The image of a strong and stoic president, brought to tears by the loss of his son, was a reminder that even the most powerful men are vulnerable to the heartbreak of war. 6. Sarah Delano Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt's mother. Imagine being the mother of a president who led the nation through the Great Depression and World War II, someone whose decisions would shape the future of America. For Franklin D. Roosevelt, that person was his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. But while she is often overshadowed by her son's immense legacy, her death in 1941 was a complex and emotionally charged moment in both FDR's life and the public's perception of the Roosevelt family. Sarah Delano Roosevelt was an overbearing presence in FDR's life, a fact that became apparent even during his presidency. She was deeply involved in his career and his decisions, often acting as a guiding force behind the scenes. But as FDR became more established in his role as president, Sarah's control over him started to become more public, leading to a somewhat awkward dynamic. The nation knew that Franklin Roosevelt, despite his immense popularity, remained emotionally reliant on his mother well into adulthood. When Sarah passed away in 1941, her death represented more than just the loss of a mother. It was the loss of a deeply entwined relationship that had been publicly scrutinized for years. Franklin Roosevelt's reliance on his mother was well known, and the fact that her death came at such a crucial time during his presidency only added to the burden he faced. It wasn't just a personal loss, it was a moment that revealed a deeply human side to FDR, one that the public had never really seen before. While Sarah's death wasn't scandalous or embarrassing in a traditional sense, it did force Franklin Roosevelt to confront the fact that the woman who had helped shape his career was gone. It added a layer of vulnerability to his character that had been previously hidden beneath the weight of his public duties. The nation mourned her passing, but it also symbolized the end of an era for FDR, an era in which his mother had played a central role in his leadership. 7. Jacqueline Kennedy's assassination, a public tragedy and personal chaos. When President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, it shook the world to its core. But what many don't realize is just how publicly devastating this death was not only for the nation but also for the First Lady, Jacqueline Kennedy. Her grief, raw and unfiltered, became a spectacle that no one could ignore. It was a moment of profound personal tragedy mixed with an unbearable public burden. Jacqueline Kennedy, often regarded as one of the most iconic and graceful First Ladies, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight of mourning. The nation watched as she clung to her husband's body, her tears captured in photographs that would be etched into the memories of generations to come. But her grief was not just a personal experience, it was also a public one that played out in front of the eyes of the world. What made Jacqueline Kennedy's grief particularly complicated was the media frenzy that surrounded her. She became the face of a grieving nation, but this role forced her to mourn in the most public way possible. The raw, unfiltered nature of her sorrow was often captured by photographers and reporters, turning her private anguish into something everyone felt they had a right to witness. Her stoic, yet visibly devastated, appearance in the days following JFK's assassination was the epitome of grace under pressure. But behind that composed exterior, Jacqueline was falling apart. The media circus surrounding her mourning was not only invasive but also uncomfortable. What was once a private, deeply personal loss became a public spectacle, and the First Lady's suffering was laid bare for all to see. Jacqueline Kennedy's strength, in the face of such tragedy, is still remembered as one of the most remarkable displays of resilience. But what most don't realize is how much the death of her husband and the media's invasion of her grief embarrassed and traumatized her. It was a tragedy that became far more than just a political loss. It was an emotional one that would forever haunt her. 8. Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Kennedy's sister. Lee Radziwill, Jacqueline Kennedy's younger sister, lived a life that was both glamorous and fraught with personal struggles. Though she was often in the public eye, her death in 2019 marked the end of a life that was marred by the same complexities that haunted her sister's life, albeit in a different way. While Jacqueline's life was filled with public admiration and tragedy, Lee's life was filled with public embarrassment, failed marriages, and family tension that spilled out into the public domain. Lee Radziwill became a style icon, known for her elegance and charm, but her personal life was anything but smooth. She was married to a European aristocrat, Prince Stanislaw Albrecht Radziwill, but their marriage ended in scandal. She also had a rocky relationship with her sister, Jacqueline, one that was often overshadowed by the Kennedy family's complex dynamics. Though Jacqueline had become the nation's first lady, Lee was often seen as the less successful and more troubled sister. In the years leading up to her death, Lee Radziwill's public image was marred by her failed relationships and the perception that she had lived in the shadow of her more famous sister. Jacqueline's tragic death in 1994 further complicated Lee's life, as she was left to navigate the residual grief of her sister's passing while grappling with her own personal difficulties. Lee's own death, which was met with mixed public reactions, seemed almost inevitable given the nature of her life, a life marked by the sense of living in the shadows of the Kennedys. Despite her public persona as a socialite and fashion icon, Lee's passing was a reminder of the complex and often painful family dynamics that the public never fully understood. Her death, although mourned by some, was met with a sense of discomfort by many who remembered her as the sister who couldn't escape the drama of her family's legacy. 9. Richard Nixon, a death surrounded by mixed emotions. Richard Nixon, the 37th President of the United States, left office under the dark cloud of the Watergate scandal in 1974. His resignation was one of the most dramatic moments in American political history, and his legacy has been forever tainted by the scandal. Nixon's death in 1994, however, was met with a mixture of respect, relief, and discomfort. While some mourned the loss of the man who had served as president during some of the most tumultuous times in American history, others couldn't shake the feeling that his passing marked the end of a painful chapter in U.S. politics. For many, Nixon's death was a reminder of the deep divide his presidency had caused. The Watergate scandal left an indelible stain on his reputation, and while he had been able to maintain a degree of respect for his accomplishments, particularly in foreign policy, the scandal overshadowed everything else. Nixon's passing didn't come with the kind of outpouring of grief that is often reserved for beloved presidents. Instead, it was met with a cold acknowledgement of the complexities of his legacy. What made Nixon's death particularly awkward was the lingering resentment toward him from the public. Even after his resignation, there were still many who viewed him as a figure of scandal and deceit. His funeral, though attended by world leaders and political figures, felt more like a formal conclusion to a story that had been tarnished by betrayal and mistrust. Nixon's legacy was marked by his failure to come to terms with the truth, and his death felt like a final chapter that, for many, could never be fully reconciled. 10. Betty Ford, Gerald Ford's wife. Betty Ford, the wife of President Gerald Ford, is remembered as one of the most open and honest first ladies in U.S. history. However, it wasn't just her advocacy for breast cancer awareness that made her stand out. It was her courage in the face of personal struggles that resonated deeply with the public. Betty Ford's battles with alcohol and prescription drug addiction were highly publicized, and her honesty about her struggles made her an icon of recovery and resilience. But what many don't realize is how her personal demons affected her public image, especially before she became a beacon for addiction recovery. Betty Ford's addiction issues were kept out of the public eye for a time, but once they were revealed, they became part of her legacy. When she passed away in 2011, Betty Ford was remembered not just for her role as First Lady, but for her contributions to addiction treatment and mental health awareness. However, her death marked the conclusion of a life that had been filled with both triumphs and struggles. Betty Ford's passing was a reminder of how public life and private battles can intersect in surprising ways. Though she became a symbol of strength and recovery, her early struggles with addiction were deeply embarrassing to the Ford family and often overshadowed her public duties. Her death, like her life, was both a reflection of triumph over adversity and a reminder of the personal cost of living in the public eye. 11. George H.W. Bush, a legacy marked by personal and political struggles. When George H.W. Bush passed away in 2018, the world said goodbye to a former president who had navigated the Cold War, the Gulf War, and the complex dynamics of the post-Reagan era. Yet, his death, while somber, didn't come without a touch of awkwardness. The end of Bush SRS life coincided with some unresolved feelings regarding his legacy, especially in relation to his son, George W. Bush, and the controversial years of the Iraq War. The father-son dynamic between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush had always been complicated. While George H.W. was a respected figure who had been at the forefront of international diplomacy, his son's presidency had been marked by a deeply polarizing war in Iraq, which many saw as an overreach, partly because of the mistakes made during George H.W. Bush's tenure. For many, George W. Bush's actions in the Middle East overshadowed his father's diplomatic efforts. Despite this, the elder Bush's passing was met with mixed emotions. Some hailed his role as a statesman and a leader who guided the country through turbulent times. But for others, the passing of George H.W. Bush was a reminder of the bitter divisions left in the wake of both his own presidency and the Iraq War that followed. The sense of relief from those who had opposed his son's policies made his death more complicated than one might expect. Yet, there was also a certain grace in his final days, a dignified closing to a public life filled with both triumph and controversy. George H.W. Bush's death marked the end of an era for the Bush family, but it also highlighted the awkward, unresolved tension between father and son. Despite his long legacy in American politics, the mixed emotions surrounding his death suggested that political dynasties can often carry more baggage than many realize. 12. George W. Bush, the ongoing legacy. While George W. Bush is still alive, the eventual passing of the 43rd president is already a topic of speculation. His presidency, marked by the attacks of 9/11 and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, left a deeply complicated legacy. For many, George W. Bush's death will serve as an opportunity for the country to reflect on his years in office, and whether history will judge him as a visionary leader or as a man whose decisions led to unnecessary conflict. What makes George W. Bush's eventual passing so intriguing is the divided nature of his legacy. Some Americans view his decisions to invade Iraq and Afghanistan as misguided, while others see him as a hero who protected the nation after the 9/11 attacks. However, these mixed views mean that his death will likely stir up intense political debates, forcing the country to revisit the controversial policies that defined his presidency. Beyond his foreign policy decisions, there are other personal elements of George W. Bush's life that will be examined after his passing. His relationship with his father, the former president, George H.W. Bush, and the tensions that arose during their time in office will inevitably come up. His political trajectory, his presidency, and the family legacy will be weighed by the public and historians alike. Though still alive, George W. Bush's eventual death will not be the end of his story. It will mark the beginning of a new chapter in the long and often turbulent history of the Bush family. His death will not only bring a reflection on his presidency, but will also serve as a powerful reminder of the complicated, often messy, intersection between personal lives and political power. 13. Roger Clinton, Bill Clinton's brother. When Bill Clinton was elected as president in 1992, the spotlight was on him, but his brother, Roger Clinton, was never far from the media's gaze. Roger, known for his legal troubles, substance abuse issues, and erratic behavior, became a source of embarrassment for his brother's presidential campaign and time in office. Though Bill Clinton tried to shield his family from public scrutiny, Roger's public failures became a shadow that hung over the Clinton presidency. Roger Clinton was a man with a troubled past, and his criminal record became a source of public embarrassment, particularly after Bill Clinton commuted his brother's sentence for a drug-related conviction. Many questioned Bill's decision to intervene, and it only added to the perception that the Clintons had family issues that were not in line with the ideal first family image. Roger's behavior and public troubles never seemed to align with the clean-cut image that Bill Clinton wanted to project, and many of his brother's legal battles became fodder for late-night talk shows and tabloids. Roger Clinton's death in 2021 marked the end of a life filled with turmoil and controversy. While his passing was not marked by the same kind of public reflection as his brother's presidency, it was impossible to ignore the relationship between Bill and Roger, which had always been fraught with complications. Despite his legal troubles, Roger's death was a sad reminder that even the most powerful political figures are not immune to the dysfunctions and struggles of their families. 14. John F. Kennedy Jr.'s plane crash, a tragic end to a high-profile life. John F. Kennedy Jr., the son of assassinated President John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy, was a figure who seemed destined for greatness. He was charismatic, intelligent, and incredibly photogenic, qualities that made him a beloved figure in American culture. But in 1999, his promising future was tragically cut short when his plane crashed into the Atlantic Ocean, taking his life, along with the lives of his wife Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and her sister Lauren Bessette. The tragedy was deeply felt by the American public, but what made it even more complicated was the media circus surrounding John's death. While the crash itself was tragic, the media frenzy that followed felt almost exploitative. The endless coverage of the plane crash, the search efforts, and the aftermath of the Kennedy family's mourning only added to the sense of public embarrassment that surrounded the loss. The Kennedys, who had been through so much tragedy already, found themselves thrust into yet another public spectacle, one that many people felt was inappropriately invasive. The fact that John F. Kennedy Jr. was still in his prime, with so much potential ahead of him, made the tragedy even more devastating. The crash seemed like the final cruel twist in a family history marked by loss and scandal. The public's insatiable desire to know every detail of the crash only added to the sense of embarrassment and personal violation for the Kennedy family. It was as though their grief was no longer their own, but something that belonged to the public. 15. Joe Biden's legacy, a future shaped by public and personal struggles. Joe Biden, the 46th President of the United States, is currently navigating a presidency that is both historic and fraught with challenges. His eventual death, though far in the future, will likely be marked by both mourning and reflection. As the first president to openly grapple with issues such as his son Beau's death from brain cancer and his own health struggles, Biden's passing will likely prompt public discourse not only about his political legacy but also about his deeply human struggles. Biden's legacy, shaped by his decades in politics, will be viewed through a complex lens after his death. On the one hand, he is the man who brought stability back to the US after the Trump presidency, but on the other, his personal challenges, losing his son to cancer, struggling with public family issues, will influence how history remembers him. For many, Biden will always be remembered as a figure of resilience, but there will also be elements of his presidency that will be the subject of debate long after he's gone. The personal and public battles Biden has faced will ensure that his legacy is multifaceted. His death, whenever it occurs, will prompt a re-evaluation of his presidency, the effectiveness of his leadership, and the personal costs of being in the public eye. Whether his death will lead to a renewed appreciation for his work or spark more political division remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: his passing will mark the end of one of the most defining presidencies in modern American history.